Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about comics. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the MCU is going to bring the X-Men in fairly soon. But my main topic, and why I'm going to talk about those other things, is how quote-unquote progressive entertainment and storytelling masterfully uses advertising, and they do so in a way to sell advertising as if it were a story. Because, quite honestly, some of the stories that we all consume, and it doesn't matter where they're from, whether you're talking about novels or television or movies or your video games or tabletop games or anything else, some of these stories that you're consuming and believing to be stories are nothing more than an advertising technique in themselves. So let's start off with the X-Men and how the X-Men are going to be brought into the MCU. Quite honestly, I believe that Marvel has been keeping the X-Men as a trump card so that when things really start to go south, they're going to introduce the X-Men in order to prop up the MCU and bring it back to being the big boy on the block for movie production within Hollywood for another 10 years. And I believe that that time is now. But that's just my interpretation of things. You can take that or leave it. However, we do know that the X-Men are now going to be brought into the MCU, and quite specifically how they're going to be brought into the MCU. And it appears how they're going to be brought into the MCU is through the Ms. Marvel television series. And yes, you heard that right. This character, which is supposed to be an Inhuman, they're probably going to turn into a mutant, and then they're going to make her the first mutant within the MCU, and through this show, then bring the idea of mutants into the MCU and then the X-Men into the MCU. This, by the way, is not only gleaned from the last episode of Ms. Marvel, but also from some of the producers, one of them being Son Amanat, who said yes, she always wanted to make Ms. Marvel a mutant. But the point being that in order to really understand where the X-Men are going to fit into the MCU, you're probably going to have to watch the Ms. Marvel show, which is exactly what they did with WandaVision and the Doctor Strange movie, Into the Multiverse of Madness. A lot of people, normal people who don't watch everything Marvel, went to go see that movie and said, I think I'm missing something here. They're not telling a whole story. Well, no, they weren't. They weren't telling a whole story because in order to understand everything that was going on, you need to either go back and watch WandaVision or at the very least know the basic plot summary of all of the episodes of WandaVision in order to understand what's going on within the movie itself. So the same thing is going to happen here. They're going to take their lowest viewed show ever, as compared to other Marvel shows, or actually watching this and start propping it up and start getting people to watch it, because in order to understand the whole mutant thing that's going to come in and rejuvenate the MCU, you gotta go watch Ms. Marvel. Now, first off, before I get into the advertising part of this, I have to ask, just how much does that tick you off? If it does tick you off, put that in the comments. But here's where this whole thing got me to thinking, and some other discussions around the X-Men as they're being published in Marvel Comics right now. This entire thing is part of Marvel's lifestyle branding, because it was, I think, 2016 when Son Amanat, who was then the person really in operational control of Marvel Comics, who, yes, is the person that I just talked about, who is the producer on the Ms. Marvel show, she declared that Marvel was a lifestyle brand. Now, I've gone over this a couple of times on my channel, but I haven't really gone in depth with it for about 3 years now. So I'll go over this a little bit more because it's very important to understand what's going on here. Because I think this lifestyle branding of Marvel is not just a lifestyle branding of Marvel Comics, but a lifestyle branding of Marvel itself as a whole, including the television and the movies and the comics and the merchandise, and possibly even some parts of lifestyle branding which are connected to other companies within Disney. But before I get there, I just want to say that I'm always talking about this quote-unquote progressivism, and really progressivism as a political strain of thought in its many iterations all through the years, through the centuries really, has had to use advertising in a very keen and cunning way in order to keep their ideas alive. Why? Because they typically base their political actions upon this quote-unquote progressive ideal, it goes south fairly quickly because it's not based in reality. There is either a catastrophe or a pile of bodies left in its wake, and then they have to therefore rebrand themselves through advertising techniques in order to show, no, we're not those people of the past. We're something completely new, when they are exactly those people of the past, just with a new paint job. Just to give you a couple of examples of this, the whole idea of critical race theory, which in itself is derived from critical theory. That was quite literally a bunch of Marxist socialists getting together and saying, well, how do we continue to promote Marxist socialism when we know that our message has failed? Well, they came up with the idea of we rebrand it as critical theory. And that's exactly what they did. And that's exactly what they state that they did. Similarly, the exact same thing happened with postmodernism. You see, critical theory was Marxist ideology that was more focused on a German or Russian interpretation of it, but postmodernism is the exact same thing. It's a Marxist worldview that was interpreted in a French way, which they realized was dead and they had to distance themselves from, and so they came up with rebranding it as postmodernism. And again, the people who were the creators of this strain of thought openly admit this. Or if you want to bring it closer to home, look at what the Democratic Party within the US has done over its lifetime. They say to the masses, well, look, we used to be this party that participated in all of these ugly things, all of this oppression down in the southern states and wearing white robes and the such. But there was a point in our history where we completely flipped ourselves over and we became the exact opposite of that. They didn't become the exact opposite of that. All they did was rebrand themselves. And you can see that quite obviously by their constant focus still on race, which is exactly what they used to be focused on and what brought about all of their actions in the past. So yes, all of this quote-unquote progressive movement, it constantly has to rebrand itself. So they are very, very well acquainted with rebranding themselves and with advertising as a whole. And as advertising developed, especially over the last century, and became more and more intricate and tied in with things like psychology and understanding how to get into the unconscious part of people's minds, they started, of course, to use these techniques to sell their quote-unquote progressive ideology. And that's exactly what we see around us today within modern storytelling. But let's get into a little bit more of a specific about that. The specific, again, is the lifestyle branding. Now, what is lifestyle branding? Well, if advertising is a way to get you to buy a product, traditional advertising gets you to buy that product by presenting you with some kind of argument as to why you should buy this product. But here's the thing. That old type of advertising has become very restrictive. Why? If you want to make an argument, an actual argument about how good this product is, you have to be very specific and you have to talk about exactly what it does. But you see, if you use something like lifestyle branding, this is a way of using an emotional argument to sell the product. Not an actual argument, but more of a rhetorical argument. And this is why lifestyle branding is very much tied up with storytelling itself. And that would be because storytelling itself is a rhetorical argument, and what they wish to use is not actual argumentation based on fact, but rhetorical argumentation based upon feelings. That's how they wish to use advertising, and that's how lifestyle branding actually works. So to give you a couple of examples, I'm going to dredge this up from my memory. I might be conflating two or more commercials, but the basic principle still stands. There was a commercial a couple of years ago, I think it was during the Super Bowl, where you had a little narrative that was playing on the screen. And if it's the first time you've ever seen this commercial, you have no idea what's going on. You have no idea what they're trying to sell. What they're going to give you is a little story. It's a little narrative. And this narrative, again, is tied in usually to provoke the feels. It's usually something that's based upon a family, something where you can have a tiny little narrative that pulls at the heartstrings. Now, within such commercials, you don't put up any kind of logos or anything like that. If they are there, they must be in the background. What you typically should do for lifestyle branding is use things like the shape of your logo. Put that in the background. Or the colors that you use to sell your product. Put that in the background. And then, once they've gone through their little narrative, then they flash up the logo at the very end and let you know who this little story, which made you feel good, was actually brought to you by. And the point being that you then equate the good feelings about your own life, which is invoked by this little story, with good feelings about the company and good feelings about their products. And next time you go to buy that kind of product, you buy their product. So within this commercial that was on during the Super Bowl, you had a little girl and she was building a go-kart, if I remember correctly, and she talked about how she wanted to be environmentally friendly, or there was a voiceover about being environmentally friendly, and then you had this girl, she was working then with her father to build this go-kart, and as this played out, the father helped the girl build this go-kart, and she became triumphant at the end by driving this go-kart around, and then at the end of this story, you have a logo, I think it was Oldsmobile, that was flashing up in the background. So what's the point of this entire thing? Well, the point is to make you feel for this little girl who's afraid for her future because of the so-called threat of environmental catastrophe. And since she's afraid, you should be afraid for her. And then the father figure comes in and helps her with that and then allays her fears by showing her that, yes, they're going to help build a better future. And so you feel better about your future and your lifestyle, especially if you buy into the whole narrative of the whole world is going to die unless we do something drastic about the environment. And then that makes you feel better about your lifestyle choices. And it is that feeling which you then tie to the logo at the end, which is Oldsmobile. And you say, well, Oldsmobile is help creating a better future. Perhaps I should think about buying an Oldsmobile. Now, just one thing about advertising itself and its connection to psychological understanding that needs to be put in here. This is one of the techniques that you find is used exactly over and over again. You have a little girl, and then her father helps her, and then you have the message in the background. This is a psychological technique because, first of all, we know that the people who bring home the bacon, the breadwinner for the family, is still the man. And no, it's not because of the patriarchy. It's because men are different than women. They're psychologically and physically built differently, and therefore they can do higher stress jobs. But anyway, the point being that they bring home more money. Therefore, you want to get the person to buy your product that has the most money. Now, psychologists have found out that the best way to change the mind of a grown man is through his daughter. Quite specifically, the fatherly instinct, and to some extent this extends into the white knighting instinct, is that men want to protect the helpless female, and therefore, when this helpless female appears helpless and says, please listen to me, they begin to listen to them, and even though they would never change their mind on X subject by themselves, they then begin to listen to their daughter or the daughter figure, and in trying to protect her, then must change his mind about this subject. By the way, this was literally one of the feminist techniques within even the 80s and the 90s, where you had all of these women coming into the educational system. The feminists would say, okay, we got to teach them exactly these feminist principles, and then they have to bring them home and teach their fathers about them so that those daughters can change their fathers' minds and begin them to bring them around to our way of thinking. This was part of the educational system for at least the last 40 years. Okay, so that out of the way, let's look at a couple of smaller examples of lifestyle branding. Another example would be, let's say you're a running shoe company like Nike and you want to sell your new running shoe. Well, what do? Well, you use as part of your advertisement to go and help out, let's say at marathons within your local or even regional area. What you do as a running shoe company is that during the marathon, you set up a table where you give out water to people and you put your branding all over the table, and therefore the people associate you helping out their lifestyle, which is centered at this time anyways, around running, and therefore they have, again, a positive connection, a subliminal positive connection with your brand and helping out their life. And of course, you would strategically place these tables, which are dispensing water, at the most appropriate place within the circuit of the marathon. So the person running the marathon would think to themselves or tell the story, yes, I'm so happy with myself that I was able to finish. There was a point where I didn't think I would be able to finish, but then I rounded a turn and there was a table and they were giving out water and I grabbed one and I drank it and it just gave me the energy to go on, especially with the cheering that was coming from that table. You see, this is exactly what I mean by advertising through a subliminal way. This will make the runner feel good about their lifestyle, and it will be a good feeling that is tied to this action, which is tied to the logo, which is tied to the next time I'm going to buy a running shoe, perhaps I should buy Nike. Or the other example is, I think it's from Harley Davidson. They created an app a number of years ago wherein they would help the bikers who are going on long biker convoys. So it was a free app for bikers where it would show them on the map where they're going. What's the best place to go get gas? Where's the best place to go get repairs if you need repairs? Where's the best place to eat? Where's the best place to stop for the night? Where's the best place in security terms in order to park my bike, etc., etc. All of this was offered for free. Why? Because it's advertising. Because every time a biker pulls up this app and sees that logo and says, yeah, they're helping me out a lot by telling me where all of these things are, then it gives a positive emotional connection with the lifestyle of that person to that logo and to that company. And the next time they go to buy a bike, they say, I'm buying a Harley Davidson. Now, all of that out of the way, one of the important factors about lifestyle branding is it only works if you focus on a subculture. So people who run marathons, that's a subculture. People who are bikers, that's a subculture. People who believe in environmentalism, I'm sorry, but that's a subculture. And people who buy comics, that's a subculture. And here's the missing piece which got me to think about this entire thing. You see, people on the left typically tend to live their lives within a bubble. Typically tend to live their lives within a silo where they can only hear either their own voice reverberating back at them or the same thing that they think coming from other people around them. And we know this from studies on media, where it asks people, both on the right and the left, where you get your information from. Now, I can't claim that this is always true, but it's certainly true right now, and that's all we need to look at. And it may be true right now just because right-wing sources are just downplayed to the extreme, where left-wing sources are pumped up to the extreme. And so, in these studies, they asked people who are on the left-hand side of the spectrum where they get their news information from, and the farther and farther you get to the extreme left, the more and more isolated these people become in where they get their information from. And so they only listen to the voices that are reflecting exactly what they already believe. But when they looked at the opposite side of the spectrum, when they looked at the right-hand side of the spectrum and asked these people where they get their news information from, these people on the right would typically get their news information from more of a variety than you would see on the left. But the reason why I bring this up is because of the fact that people on the left tend to live in silos, tend to live in their own little bubble. And one of the things I can tell you right now from being in the university system for a long time and listening to all these podcasts and statements of these people over the last couple of years doing my channel, these people have the typical confirmation bias of a normal person who thinks to themselves, yeah, the entire world thinks like me. Of course they do. But that's ramped up to the extreme when you have nothing but your own thoughts reflected back at you, which typically you get within people who are on the quote-unquote progressive side of the scale. So these people typically think of themselves as everywhere. They typically think of themselves as being in the majority. They're not, but they typically do believe that, and they do believe that the people who are opposed to them, the people who they would label as haters of one kind or another, are the minority within society. Now, here's the thing. If lifestyle branding only works on subcultures, why would these quote-unquote progressive companies then target progressive people as what to focus on with lifestyle branding? Because that's what's happening right now within these quote-unquote progressive companies. They're targeting the progressive thinking person as their minority, while at the same time thinking to themselves that they're the majority and therefore they're going to make a lot of money out of them. And I can attest to this simply from listening to the podcast from Marvel. Over and over again, you would hear this underlying strain of thought where the people in charge would say or express the idea that this product, which has failed over and over again in the past, will succeed this time. Why? Because they truly believe that all they need to do is connect to the mass audience that is out there waiting to consume this exact product. They believe that mass audience is there, and they simply have failed to connect with it yet. And of course, if we're talking about something like Marvel Comics, they believe this mass audience is progressive-minded people. So back to the question, if they believe this, then how can they use lifestyle branding? Well, the thing that I didn't realize before is that how they use lifestyle branding is not to focus on progressivism itself, which is a subculture, although they don't believe that, they believe it to be the main culture, but to break up progressivism into its component parts and focus on each of those parts as if it were a subculture within society as a whole, which, again, they see society as a whole as being progressive people. So I'll give you some examples of this within comics to show you exactly what I mean. Now, within Marvel Comics, they have, for a long time, at least 40 years now, broken up their comic production into different sections. You have different sections which are headed up by editors. For example, you have the X-Men section, and then you have the Avengers section, and then you have the Fantastic Four section, and then you have stories that come in from other companies that own them, something like Conan or Star Wars or things like that. So they're very much used to sectioning off their own company into little subsections in order to control a specific thing. And this is what they've done in a very specific way for their lifestyle branding. So, for example, and I'll have to thank Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter to bring this to my attention, what they've done with the X-Men over the last number of years is that they've made them the example of the pronoun people or the alphabet people. This comic and the comic lines around them, like Wolverine and any other thing that is a mutant-based story, is all focused on a message that promotes the lifestyle of pronoun people and alphabet people. And so they tell stories which typically focus on that exact mindset, make those kind of people feel good about themselves, and then make them feel good about Marvel products. Also, for example, you have something like Miss Marvel and Captain Marvel. Those are focused on the feminist progressive. And even within that itself, Captain Marvel focuses a little bit more on traditional feminism, where Miss Marvel focuses on intersectional feminism. That's why whenever you hear anyone from Marvel or Disney talk about this character or this show, they always put these tag descriptors before her name. They say something like, she's a brown Muslim American girl living in Jersey City. They attach all of that to the first of it because that's intersectional feminism. Another example of this is why they keep on putting people on the Captain America title who literally hate America. People like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has come out over and over again calling and supporting ideas that state that America is a racist country and always has been and always will be. And the new writer, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, isn't much different. Why? Because they're appealing in this section to the people who are the Antifa type. The people who support America is racist and let's tear down this old way of thinking. That's literally what the Captain America books are about right now. And by the way, the same thing happens with DC. With the pronoun people, you have the Legion of Superheroes and the new Superman. Within the Antifa section, you have, believe it or not, Batman and the Batman family. The feminist section is led by Harley Quinn. Now, I'm sure more than one of you is saying to yourself, well, look, these people who have this lifestyle don't buy these books, so it's not working. But that's not the point. You see, the point is that these books in themselves are not meant to sell. This is why, over the last week, Eric July over at Young Ripa has started to pre-sell his first book, and he made almost $2 million so far. That's a massive amount of money. But the problem is that a lot of people are saying, look, this is him competing with Marvel and DC. But really, that's not what's going on. First of all, I gotta say, more power to Eric, because a high tide rises all boats, and it's certainly going to help me out. But the point is, stop thinking in a way where you think he's competing against Marvel and DC. He's not. Why? Because he's actually producing a product that is a comic book. Marvel and DC are not. Marvel and DC are producing comic books as simply a part of lifestyle branding, as simply a part of advertising in order to sell something else, which is typically A, the shows, and B, the movies. And again, the point is that they don't have to connect directly with this audience by selling these comics to them. They don't have to sell Captain Marvel and Miss Marvel comics to the feminists. They don't have to sell X-Men comics to the pronoun people. They don't have to sell the Captain America comics to the Antifa-minded people. All they need to do is to make these comics and then have them exist and then have people write stories about them and put the idea of their existence out into the world. And this, again, is supported by that quote which I bring up from Sana Amanat from the New York City Comic-Con a couple of years ago, where someone asked her about the America Chavez book and how its sales were dying because they were inserting progressive politics into it. And she answered and said, "You can't just look at the sales numbers. Marvel considers that book to be as successful as its most successful book because they got that story out there. The important thing was that the story got out there, not that they made money." Because a lot of people who are looking at comics are saying, why in the world would they promote and focus on asking the people who they are connected to promote this book or that book when they know they're not going to sell? They have other comics which actually have good stories. If you promoted that good story comic above these other ones which you know is not going to sell, you would actually sell a lot more comics. That's the exact point. They're not trying to sell comics. What they're trying to do is to sell the idea that these comics exist. That's it. That's why they get these people in the New York Times or on CNN or in any other corporate media site to talk about their comics, because all they have to do is produce a comic with a message that is tied to the lifestyle of these specific kind of people. Then they use their strings and their contacts to put it out into the world that this comic exists. And as soon as those people who are part of that lifestyle see that it exists and see that it is in some way poking someone in the eye who they disagree with, then it makes them feel good about their lifestyle, and that feeling good about their lifestyle is then connected to the idea of Marvel as a good brand, and then the next time they go to watch a show or go to a movie, they say, yeah, I'm going to watch a Marvel show. Yeah, I'm going to go see a Marvel movie. Comics right now are the equivalent of that free app given to those people who drive motorcycles, or the water station run by a running shoe company that's on the last leg of a marathon. There's something created as part of an advertising campaign to get the word out to people of specific lifestyles that Marvel is on their side. They're not a product in themselves. Now let's for 1 second move back to what I talked about at the first, about the fact that Marvel is going to bring the X-Men into the MCU through the Miss Marvel show. Again, this entire thing is a part of not only lifestyle branding, but the exact kind of lifestyle branding I talked about at the first. Why? Because you have this show about a young girl, and this young girl is portrayed as being a very vulnerable young girl, and it is in a very childish manner that she acts and that the entire show is constructed. And so, if you want to sell the progressive message, especially within the movies, well, you gotta lead up to it. And this is exactly the kind of advertising I talked about at the first, where you use young girls, daughters, which plays into the male compulsion to be a white knight. You present this character, which again is a reflection of intersectional feminism. You bring that progressive idea into these stories. You then bring it into a show. You make sure people have to watch this show in order to then understand the rest of the movies. And so again, you have lifestyle branding at level 1, which is in the comics, at level 2, which is in the shows, at level 3, which is the actual product, which is the movies, and to some extent, the merchandise. And some of you may be saying, well, that's a whole lot of money and a whole lot of effort to actually put into all of this just to get people to go see the movies. First of all, with the amount of money that movies typically make, I would say no. But at the same time, This is a more modern interpretation of what charity used to be, where you had these companies that would give a massive amount of money to these charities. Why? Because it's a tax write-off. They do the exact same thing right now, but it isn't so much that it is a tax write-off, it's the fact that they can use these things to promote their ESG score, which is basically a social credit score for companies. And yes, every company that you can think of within the US right now has this kind of social credit score. Disney and Marvel certainly do. I've looked it up a number of times. Just go to Google and put in the name of whatever large company you can think of and ESG. You'll find it. They all participate in this social credit system. This social credit system is the new version of I'm giving to charity and therefore I get something out of it. But here's the linchpin to the entire thing. And being the linchpin, it is indeed their weakest link. And I've talked about this a number of times on older videos. What these companies are trying to do is to not just build an audience, but grow an audience. And how do they do that? Well, they do that by promoting this kind of ideological thinking within the youngest people they can get their hands on. Because, first of all, this kind of branding and this kind of selling, which is an emotional kind of advertising and selling to people, this is much easier and much cheaper than your traditional kind of advertising. You let the people and their lifestyle do half the work. And the younger you can get to them, the more ensconced into their life and their lifestyle these quote-unquote progressive ideas are going to be, the more they can manipulate them in an emotional way in order to sell them these products. And the thing being is that people on the left, especially the far left, typically don't have large families. They typically, a lot of them, don't have any children of their own. And so how they grow this audience is by taking control of the upbringing of other people's children into their purview. That is to say, they say to themselves, I'm going to, quote unquote, help raise your child through television, through movies, through video games, through any other kinds of media, and of course, through the public school system in order to bring them up in a way that they believe these progressive ideas, which then plays into our ability to use this kind of easy lifestyle branding in order to sell them the new product. Again, this has been part of the progressive ideal for, at least 100 years now. You go back to Vladimir Lenin and his statement, what was it? Give me 4 years to teach the children and what I plant will never be uprooted. That's exactly his mindset. Or let's go back to Sana Amanat, the person who was in charge of Marvel Comics for the last decade and is now helping produce the Miss Marvel show. When they were starting to put this character into animated shows on Disney+. She was on a podcast where here you have this woman who doesn't have any children sitting down and telling the people who are listening to this podcast, if you are a parent, please take your child and sit them down in front of this cartoon. And she said, especially if they're boys. Why? Because you will then teach them that boys should be comfortable in liking girl things. And you as a parent need to take your boy and make them like girl things. Again, this is exactly the idea of taking the youngest kind of people, because these cartoons were for very, very young people, preschool children, if not 3 to 4-year-olds, and to indoctrinate them into a very specific kind of ideology where they're purposefully confusing male with female as part of course, this quote-unquote progressive ideology. Because you see, the most important subsection of the population which they want to focus on with lifestyle branding is young children. Again, just on my channel over the last couple of years, going over these Marvel podcasts and these statements coming out from Marvel, I've done several videos about not only that statement that you just heard, but several statements like that, talking about how they need to bring very young children into this progressive mindset through these products. The one I always reference is that BookCon, which Marvel was a part of, wherein there was an actual panel about how to insert progressive talking points into children's picture books. The most important subsection of the society is the young progressive, is the progressive of tomorrow, are the children that they're going to help raise and then grow into their new audience in the next 10 years. So when people are wondering why Disney is putting so much effort into combating, let's say, the new laws that are going into place in Florida, or putting out things like the new Buzz Lightyear movie, or as was recently reported on, and I myself did a video about this, about the Zoom meeting with these Disney executives talking about how they specifically need to push farther and farther into this progressive ideology and include it more and more so that it's at least 50% of what they produce as entertainment. Why are they doing all of those things? It's because it's part of their advertising platform. They need to grow this new audience through this emotional manipulation, which is part of lifestyle branding, so that they can continue their lifestyle branding after they grow up through whatever subsection of progressivism that they identify with, whether it be feminism, intersectional feminism, Antifa, the pronoun people, the alphabet people. It doesn't matter. As long as they can put them into one of those slots, as long as they can help raise them to be that kind of a person, they become supremely susceptible to the advertising campaigns that they want to use, which are the easiest and cheapest way of selling their products. This, by the way, is why when I produce a comic, it has right on the front of it, for all ages. Why? Because I want to produce a comic which is for all ages, which anybody can interact with. It doesn't matter if you're a young child or not. And this is the kind of entertainment that needs to be produced. Stuff that is accessible to younger people, not just us older people who are out here wanting some better entertainment. Because really, this entire culture war that is going on around us is primarily about the hearts and minds of young children. That is how these quote-unquote progressive people perpetuate their ideas and their ideology. And that's what we need to focus on as well. We need to focus on traditional products and traditional ways of advertising and traditional ways of connecting with our audience, because those traditional ways were actual argumentation. They weren't rhetorical, feeling-based arguments, or at the very least, they weren't completely rhetorical, feeling-based arguments. They were arguments that were presented to an audience, whether they be children or not, that actually allow the participation of the independent thought of the person you're selling the product to. And if we fail as individuals or as a society to bring up the next generation in a way that they can have independent thought of their own, then the battle we are fighting right now is already lost. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.